Congressman Raskin, we're live.
Great. Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those members of the committee and those witnesses who are joining us from out on the West Coast. Welcome to today's Democratic Roundtable on the Bill of Rights in the Balance, the deployment of federal troops against the American people. I organized this roundtable today with help from my esteemed Oregon colleagues, Representative Suzanne Bonamici from the 1st District and Representative Earl Blumenauer from the 3rd. Both of them are with us here today. We've worked together to address the frightening outburst of authoritarianism in the streets of downtown Portland by the deployment of anonymous federal officers on the streets of America. And I want to thank Representatives Bonamici and Blumenauer for joining me in organizing this roundtable, and also for being such great leaders through this very difficult process in the city that they jointly represent in Oregon. I'm going to take a few minutes to give my opening remarks, no more than 5. We have lived through some very tough times recently with the Trump administration unleashing the power of the federal government on the people. I saw it first very close to my district in Montgomery County, Frederick County, Carroll County, Maryland, which borders the District of Columbia, when the President and Attorney General Barr unleashed the might of one of these presidential battalions on more than 2,000 nonviolent civil rights protesters who had come to Lafayette Square as part of a Black Lives Matter protest. There are 6 rights contained in the Bill of Rights. There is the right to peaceably assemble. There's the right to petition government for redress of grievances. There's the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, and there's the free exercise of religion and no establishment of religion. The president, in one fell swoop, essentially managed to violate every single one of the rights in the Bill of Rights as they mowed down protesters with tear gas and pepper spray, batons, officers on horseback. They cleared a path. The president went on to conduct the most grotesque photo opportunity in the history of the United States as they trampled on the religious rights of people at St. John's Episcopal Church who had not been warned and certainly not invited the president to come barging in. And at that point, the president did his very best in his typically inept and incompetent way to unify church and state by lifting someone else's Bible upside down over his head in order to create the unlawful union of church and state in the country. But this was just a dress rehearsal for what was to come. And we saw what took place in Oregon, and we're going to hear about the Battle of Portland from the people who were the victims of this federal attack by Barr and by Donald Trump. As the country attempts to reckon with the sordid history of racism in the country, the president, rather than rising to the occasion to try to participate in this dialogue, instead has tried to use these magnificent nonviolent protests cheered on by our late beloved colleague John Lewis as the setting to create violent confrontations and to score cheap political points for his floundering re-election campaign. And Portland has been at the center of it. And it was clear from the beginning that this was a radical break from prior practice of the Department of Homeland Security. And I think at least 4 of the former secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security warned against what the department was doing. Tom Ridge, who was President Bush's first DHS secretary, warned that DHS was not designed to become the president's personal militia. Bush's second secretary, Michael Chertoff, called it politically performative. Janet Napolitano called it totally inappropriate. And Jay Johnson warned that DHS was engaged in a systematic violation of federal civil rights whose images were virtually indistinguishable from what can be seen in authoritarian societies. State and local leaders in Oregon protested, the governor, the mayor. The federal agents who came to Portland had no specialized training in how to respond to mass protests, a form of inexperience which has resulted in gross and intolerable abuses of civil liberties and bodily security. And with each passing day, the agents' blatant disregard for the Constitution and legal constraints became ever more clear to the country. So we have with us today two protesters who were the victims of acts of aggression by federal officers. One, Mr. Christopher David, a Navy veteran, now known affectionately online as Captain Portland, was assaulted by federal officers when he approached them to ask if they remembered to maintain their oaths to the Constitution. And for that act of remarkable bravery and plain-spoken honesty, Chris David was repaid with pepper spray in the face at point-blank range and severe beatings with batons that left him with a broken hand. Another protester joining us today is Mark Pettibone, who was picked up by officers, apparently in an unmarked van, and he was picked up after leaving a protest and walking back. But he'll tell us our story, which is a remarkable one indeed. And we're going to hear more tales of outrageous violations of the civil rights of the people. It should go without saying, none of this is any kind of excuse for violence on the part of the protesters. And we know that there has been an effort by the Boogaloo Boys and Proud Boys and different white supremacist groups to infiltrate the protests in order to instigate violence. But whether the violence comes from any of those extremist right-wing white supremacist groups, or any of it comes from Antifa, although I have to say that none of the Department of Justice filings related to arrests or indictments in these cases have found any Antifa involvement. But if there were involvement by Antifa in violence, then I denounce it in unmitigated way. We don't want violence coming from anybody, but it looks pretty clear to me that the violence is being used to try to stage these photographic confrontations that the president is so fond of in order to tell a particular kind of story, when in fact Black Lives Matter has been an overwhelmingly nonviolent movement standing in complete historical solidarity with John Lewis and with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and all of the nonviolent protests that have made the civil rights movement such an important positive force in American history. So the president has threatened to continue to deploy federal agents to other American cities with Democrat mayors and Democrat governors. And so we have to speak out clearly, articulately, loudly, and ferociously against these new authoritarian police state tactics of mobilizing federal officers in this way. I want to thank all of our witnesses for coming, very eager to hear from them. And at this point, I want to give my Portland area colleagues in the House of Representatives a chance to share their thoughts about where we are right now. And I'll begin, Representative Bonamici, with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Congressman Raskin, and of course, Congresswoman Maloney, for convening the panel today. And really thank you to the panelists who are here to share your stories. Special welcome to the Oregonians, Senator Lou Frederick, Mark Pettibone, Christopher David, Kelly Simon. Your experiences and perspectives are so critical to helping us understand the gravity of our current constitutional crisis, and importantly, to educate our colleagues about what really happened and is happening on the ground. Congressman Raskin and other members of the Oversight Committee, I know Congressman Blumenauer and I are so appreciative of the support that you have shown to Portland over the last few weeks. So many of our colleagues have reached out in solidarity, and Oregonians have felt supported by people across the country. When Donald Trump sent paramilitary officers from a Customs and Border Patrol SWAT team to Portland, it unquestionably endangered our community and set a terrifying precedent for what could happen in other cities nationwide. Today, as you heard, we're going to hear from Mr. David. Chris David had his hand broken and was sprayed. Mr. Pettibone was pulled into an unmarked van, detained for questioning, and eventually released without charges. What they and countless others experienced at the hands of federal law enforcement is outrageous and unacceptable, a violation of constitutional rights. We know there are many others like them, peaceful protesters who were gassed and beaten and shot with so-called less lethal munitions. People have really been hurt. Protesters in Portland have been rallying because Black Lives Matter, and they're demanding justice in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and countless other Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement. I know the BIPOC communities of Oregon are demanding change, and all of us, local, state, and federal leaders, must continue our commitment to work with them and make change happen. State Senator Lou Frederick, one of my former colleagues, is here today. I'm eager to hear his perspective on the protest, but also on the work that remains. For decades, Senator Frederick has fought for police reform and racial justice, and his insight on what is happening in Portland is central to understanding how we move forward, both in Portland, in Oregon, and as a country. Donald Trump made clear from his actions and his words that he would rather sow fear and violence than rise to the moment and lead the country to healing and reconciliation. I'm grateful that Oregon's Governor Brown has negotiated a plan for these paramilitary federal forces to retreat from Portland. It appears to be helping to reduce violence and tensions, but it's also clear that the president will not hesitate to use federal troops to attack Americans in the future. This conversation is an important one, and I want to note that shortly after the clearing of Lafayette Square by federal troops that Representative Raskin mentioned, I had a roundtable conversation with Purple Heart veterans here in Oregon. It was about the time that we found out, the news broke that it very well could be Russia's paying a bounty on American troops. And the veterans I spoke with cared deeply about that, but they also cared equally about what happened in Lafayette Square. They said, we did not sign up to serve our country to fight against our fellow Americans. So I want to note that my colleagues in the House and I have been addressing the issues from many angles. In addition to this oversight conversation that we're having today and the oversight role, we're also using the appropriations process to defund the tactics we saw in Portland. We have legislation to prohibit authoritarian police practices. We did pass in the House the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We continue to address systemic racism in our communities, in education, in housing and employment, and in so many of the other areas. So I want to thank again Congressman Raskin and Congressman Maloney for holding this conversation, but especially to those who have been here on the ground in Portland. Chris, Mark, we want to hear from you. Thank you for sharing your stories. And I yield back and allow time for my other colleague and our panelists. Thank you.
Representative Bonamici, thank you so much for those inspiring remarks. And we'll turn it over now to our colleague, Representative Ed Blumenauer.
Thank you very much, Congressman Raskin, Chairwoman Maloney. We deeply appreciate this roundtable discussion. I won't repeat what you and Congresswoman Bonamici said. She lined out steps that we've taken, the coming together to try and rein in this reckless, lawless activity. The federal troops were unwelcome, uninvited, unprepared, and made a difficult situation in our community infinitely worse. Your description of what Donald Trump did in Lafayette Square, kind of a dress rehearsal for Portland. One thinks that he's out to get footage for his campaign and try and inflame tensions. We have challenges in Portland, to be clear. We've had a racist past that I think our community has been slow to come to grips with, not unlike what we're seeing around the country. And the wave of activism and protest has been energizing and important to be able to focus on that sad history and steps we need to take going forward. It's striking to me as I would attend a number of the staging areas for the early protests in Portland. There were hundreds, no, thousands of people who were organizing, who were orderly, who were committed to sending the message about why Black Lives Matter and what we need to do. They were self-monitoring. That spectacular vision of all those people laying down on the Burnside Bridge across the heart of Portland. The description that Donald Trump displayed, and along with Chad Wolf, about Portland, a city out of control and rioting, could not be further from the truth. It was a flagrant lie. And we talked about it when we were in Washington, D.C., when the federal troop presence broke forth. I had staff members, family members who were down and testified that this is not a city that's out of control. The problems that were out of control were the federal presence that was inflaming, and they behaved in ways that were uncontrolled and violent. And you're going to hear from Chris and Mark firsthand experience. When I returned to Portland this weekend, I went downtown to the Justice Center in the evening and surveyed the situation. And the reining in the federal presence had a profound effect in terms of the tenor and direction. 2 nights ago, I stood there and listened with people hearing a speech by Dr. Martin Luther King, inspiring in terms of the challenges that we face as a country. And his message of almost half a century ago is every bit as resonant today as it was then. And this is not a city out of control. The federal presence is out of control. I believe that it was deliberate to get a photo op, to be able to trump things up, and to be able to have other aspects here to interfere. Our peaceful rights to protest and to have a political dialogue is, I think, at risk in ways that are unprecedented in my lifetime in the United States. I deeply appreciate this conversation. I deeply appreciate hearing from some of our constituents who were on the front line, and Lou Frederick, Senator Frederick, who's been a champion for justice as long as I've known Lou, these 30 years. You've got great witnesses for an important discussion, and I deeply appreciate your making it possible today.
Congressman Blumenauer, thank you so much for those excellent remarks. I'm delighted that you and Congresswoman Bonamici have joined us today and have played such central roles in standing up for real law and order, standing up for the Constitution against the lawlessness coming from the administration. Now, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. We all look forward to returning to regular order on Capitol Hill, but one of the surprising benefits of our new virtual Zoom reality is that we're able to bring people in from all over the country and all over the world, really, who otherwise might not be able to participate in conversations like this. One of our panelists today joins us from Vienna, Austria, and most of our witnesses, I think, are still in Oregon today. So we are featuring voices who are on the other side of the country and people from all over the world, and we hope that people are tuning in from every place to get the truth of what took place. Let me quickly introduce our panelists, and we'll get right into their testimony. First is the aforementioned Senator Lou Frederick, who represents the 22nd district in the Oregon legislature. Next, we have Mark Pettibone, who's a protester who was abducted from the streets of Portland and whose tale of being put into the unmarked car by unidentified officers riveted the country. Next, we have Kelly Simon, who's the interim legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union in Oregon. Next, we have Christopher David, who is the naval veteran and protester now affiliated with the group called the Wall of Vets. And last, certainly not least, we have Timothy Snyder, who is a renowned author and professor of history at Yale University. And he wrote the indispensable Tom Paine-style pamphlet called On Tyranny, which came out several years ago, and also has a magnificent book I finished not long ago called The Road to Unfreedom, about the US, Russia, and Ukraine in the period that we're in. So he's been a prolific author and activist against creeping authoritarianism in the country. So with that, we are going to begin first with Senator Frederick. You are recognized for 5 minutes. Don't be offended if I cut you off by then. All the members of Congress have 5 minutes now stenciled into our brains, and we stop talking immediately 5 minutes. But I'll remind you if you go over. Senator Frederick, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Congressman Raskin, and thank you for inviting me to testify before you. It's a great honor. I wish my mother and father were here still alive to see this. My name is Lou Frederick. I'm an Oregon State Senator from District 22 North and Northeast Portland in the Oregon Senate. I come to the issues before you from a very simple direction. I want to feel safe. I want to feel safe walking in my neighborhood, at the grocery store, downtown, on the beaches of Oregon, in our majestic forests, and in the small towns and high desert of my state. And if I do not feel safe and I need help, I want to not have anxiety about calling police to help me, because they might add to the threat regarding my life as less than human. It is very simple. In my life, I've had a police officer pull out his gun on me when I was a reporter and a passenger in a marked television news van. Until my hair turned gray, I was stopped at least once a year, often driving through my now gentrified neighborhood with the excuse that I looked lost. I worry each time a police officer pulls up behind me, worrying about whether I will live the rest of that day, depending on the mood of the cop or his need to show control and domination. I've had enough, and so have millions of others. The murder of George Floyd brought that reality of my existence and other Black men forward in ways we did not expect. It was no longer a mythical story presented by the Black community. It was a murder, on camera, by a smiling officer who was helped by 3 other officers around him. From Burns to Warrenton, Oregon, Umatilla to Coos Bay and Klamath Falls, tens of thousands of Oregonians marched to show their outrage at Floyd's death and the history of the lack of police accountability for excessive use of force against Black and brown people. Those that showed up were from across the demographic perspective. In Oregon, because of the low numbers of minorities living in the state, it was amazing and heartening to see white people of all ages and economic levels out on the street protesting for change. Those who wanted to discredit these legitimate concerns went to work immediately. For personal and clearly political reasons, agents provocateurs, already part of the mix of Portland demonstrations, moved quickly to create confrontations that they knew would prompt an overreaction from police forces. And then they quickly moved back to the back or the sides of some of the demonstrations to watch that conflict. Now, I've been watching these tactics develop for years. The last 70 days, it has been on display for those of us on the streets of Portland. And what has not been widely displayed has been the peaceful demonstrators constantly stopping dangerous activities. Instead, the media has spent most of its time in the middle of any conflict that develops because news focuses on the unusual, especially broadcast and visual media. The audience doesn't see the usual since we no longer know about the usual. We think of the unusual as normal. But when a fluid is sprayed on the concrete in front of a marble building and flames for a minute, the cameras go there. Flames are more interesting, though they may actually have little impact or be put out by others. I'm asked often how I found my way to the Senate, to politics. My answer is always the same. When your first bout with tear gas is when you're 8 or 9 years old, social issues are going to be a primary point of your life. I spent my school years in the South, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, Tuskegee, and in civil rights demonstrations and committees. Dr. King was the father of my playmates. I marched regularly with John Lewis and Julian Bond and C.T. Vivian and a host of other civil rights icons. I was one of 9 desegregating my high school. The tear gas in my past came from police towards peaceful, unarmed marchers. Some things have not changed in the years. With my help, just a second. With my help and others in the legislature, Oregon has banned the use of tear gas except in riot situations. And then the definition of riot was changed by officials. Even that level of conflict was diminishing until the Homeland Security forces were brought in. Their stated goal was to bring down the intensity of the situation, restore order, and protect federal buildings. No one bought that. The show of force with camouflage riot gear, no identification except police signs, and the Gestapo tactics of spiriting people away off the streets in unmarked vans with no charges only brought out greater numbers of outraged people to the demonstrations. firing rubber bullets, pepper balls, tear gas canisters, and other projectiles at crowds of unarmed peaceful demonstrators only enraged Oregonians. Beating people on camera only confirmed the need to reform the police use of excessive force. The result of the attempted occupation was not what they expected. The administration got their B-roll footage for political commercials of armed officers in riot gear and a few examples of fences being attacked along with a few flames and boarded windows. But they also got hundreds of moms standing by, dads with leaf blowers, sending tear gas and smoke away from the unarmed protesters. As one person put it, when they fired pepper balls, we got vests. When they fired tear gas, we got gas masks. When they fired rubber bullets, we got helmets. When they fired all three, we made shields. I want to point out that all of those are defensive reactions to offensive tactics. The protective gear is not designed to hurt anyone. Before someone brings up water bottles and firecrackers thrown or dumpster fires or broken windows, I attended several marches, rallies, and demonstrations in my neighborhood and in downtown around the 3 to 6 blocks near the courthouse. Standing in the front, middle, and rear of the demonstrations gives me a perspective that is not the same as the media you see, especially in the rear of the group. Back there, I recognize agents provocateurs from previous demonstrations, especially those associated with right-wing groups. In the past, wrist slingshots from behind the peaceful crowd were used to send ball bearings over the heads of the demonstrators towards the police. I saw several people goad others towards the federal officers and then quickly move to the back of the crowd once they got close. One fellow in particular I recognized from previous demonstrations on the side of the right-wing militia crowd. I saw others handing out firecracker poppers that startle anyone, but especially folks in riot gear who are told that there are terrorists in the crowd. All of those designed to elicit a response, an overreaction to people in the peaceful crowd. But instead of generating fear, the crowd swelled from what had become several hundred to upwards of 6,000 to 10,000 in a week. And now that the feds have left the street, now that the numbers are dropping precipitously, as we return to discussing how we can make long-term lasting change and accountability with screening, recruiting, training, tracking discipline, and changes in qualified immunity. We're making these changes. Those will be marched with an awareness of disparities in housing, healthcare, transportation, economic security, and opportunity the virus has also highlighted in the last recent months. I'm going to close very quickly with a conversation I had several years ago that stays with me and motivates me daily. I was talking to a 10-year-old black youngster who I'd known his entire life. After one of our horrendous shootings of a young black man, he asked me a question. He said, "You have always told me that if I felt unsafe, I should call a policeman. But if I do, will they shoot me? I plan to change that future. I hope that you will help. Thank you very much."
Senator Frederick, thank you for your outstanding public service, and thank you for that excellent description of what's been taking place in your state, and especially for unifying the Black Lives Matter civil rights agenda with the debate over these tactics brought down against the people of Oregon in the way that they have been so confrontational and provocative in the way that the deployment has operated. So I totally appreciate that. And now at this point, I'm going to call on Mark Pettibone. Let's see, is that right? Yes. Mr. Pettibone, you may now give your opening remarks for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's an honor to follow you, Congressman. And thank you, Congressman Raskin and the Democratic members of the roundtable. Thanks for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss my experiences in the ongoing protests in Portland, Oregon. My name is Mark Pettibone. I'm an essential worker, a recent graduate student at Reed College here in Portland, and more pertinent to the issue at hand, a nonviolent protester for Black Lives Matter in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and so many more unnamed Black and Indigenous people at the hands of local and federal law enforcement. I'm speaking with you today because I want to share my experiences and shed light on the authoritarian tactics by federal government officials that further jeopardize the very fabric of our democracy. On Tuesday, July 14th, I attended a protest in front of the Multnomah County Justice Center and Marco Hatfield Federal Courthouse in downtown Portland. It started as an uneventful night in terms of interactions between protesters and police forces. I listened to Black Lives Matter speakers, chanted about justice, made some new friends playing Frisbee in the park. Both federal and Portland Police Bureau officers made brief appearances throughout the night, but each quickly retreated into their respective buildings without further escalation. At around 2:00 a.m. on July 15th, my friend and I decided to head home. As we walked west towards our vehicle, a small group of protesters stopped us at the corner of Southwest 5th Avenue and Main Street, blocks away from any federal property. They warned us that unmarked vans had been seen patrolling the perimeter of the area, with men jumping out, snatching protesters who had strayed from the larger group of protests at the park. The whole idea seemed incredible to me, but sure enough, within seconds of this conversation, an unmarked dark-colored minivan pulled up directly in front of us, and 4 or 5 people wearing military fatigues jumped out. I was shocked and afraid for my life and fled west on Main Street, while one of the people from the van pursued me on foot. As I turned the corner on Broadway, a van cut me off, and realizing I couldn't escape, I dropped to my knees, asking why several times. Nobody gave me an explanation. They didn't tell me who they were with or why I was being detained. They simply forced me into the back of the van. Once I was inside the van, someone grabbed my hands and clutched them together above my head with one hand, using the arm of the same hand to put pressure on my head and neck to keep it down. The same person, or at least I believe it was the same person, used his or her other hand to pull my beanie over my eyes and to pat me down. The person asked if I had any weapons on me, and I said no. We were then driving, and someone in the van told another person to turn their communications radio down so I couldn't hear the information being communicated, even though I was too fearful and distracted to be paying attention. The individuals in the van drove me to what I would later find out was the federal courthouse. They led me to a wall inside of a larger garage where they took my picture on a cell phone. One officer asked if they should remove my backpack, to which another responded, quote, "No, let them see him with all this," unquote. I was escorted up an elevator to a floor containing multiple cells. I faced another wall while officials took my belongings, dumped out the contents of my backpack, cuffed my hands, and shackled my ankles. Someone asked if I should have a COVID mask. The officer patting me down declined, commenting that I would receive one later. Upon seeing the contents of my backpack, one officer remarked, quote, "This is a whole lot of nothing," unquote. Another said, quote, "At least we know his hands are clean," unquote, apparently referring to the 2 bottles of hand sanitizer I had in my bag to offer people at the protest to combat COVID-19. One officer also made a point to gesture to another officer that I had an inhaler in my bag. I was then placed in a cell by myself. 2 officers later approached my cell, mentioning their names, but to the best of my recollection, not identifying the agency they worked for. They said they were about to read me my rights and that they'd record the audio. After reading me my rights, they asked if I wanted to waive them to answer some questions. I declined and asked for a lawyer, to which they responded, "This interview is now terminated," and they promptly left. Another person came by to ask if I had any illnesses, and I said, yes, I have asthma, and I'd like my inhaler. They brought me my inhaler, my glasses, shoes without the laces, socks, and a paper mask. After that, I simply waited. At one point, another person was brought into a different cell down the corridor from me. This other detainee and I were eventually released with no documentation or any record of our arrests. I was given my backpack and a garbage bag. When I checked for my cell phone and wallet, I noticed that my respirator had been snapped and broken. I was released in the early morning hours out of the north side of the federal courthouse, at which point I finally understood where I'd been and who had taken me. I called a friend to pick me up, and as we drove away, federal officers started to gas the entire block where protesters were still demonstrating. I still couldn't believe what was happening. I've returned to protests only twice since the night of my arrest. I would like to go more often, but I'm fearful of being targeted by police or those seeking vigilante justice now that I'm a known party. All in all, what I've lived through was a terrible experience. But I want to make one thing absolutely clear. What happened to me occurred over a period of hours, even if it felt like days. It traumatized me in ways that I'm still processing, but I can't begin to fathom how it must feel for people of color who have suffered 400 years of having their rights violated in this country, generation after generation. I'm so grateful to witness the resilience and strength of the Black human spirit here in Portland, particularly among those putting in the work on the ground for this movement. That's what gives me hope for this country. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. And I urge you in the strongest possible way to investigate the flagrant disregard for civil rights and civil liberties inflicted on the citizens of my proud and wonderful city, Portland, Oregon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pettibone, for your excellent testimony. And now, Ms. Simon, you're recognized for your 5 minutes.
Congressman Raskin, Congresswoman Maloney, members of Congress, on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union of Oregon and the ACLU's national office, and its more than 8 million members, activists, and supporters throughout the country, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's roundtable. My name is Kelly Simon. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the interim legal director at the ACLU of Oregon. If you hear nothing else from me today, hear this: Black Lives Matter. While the nation's attention has been fixed on Portland, police throughout the country and at all levels of government have been shamefully engaged in a concerted attack on the right to dissent, meeting the calls to end racist police brutality with more police brutality. The federal government is adding escalation on top of this escalation. In my role at ACLU of Oregon, what I have been bearing witness to is nothing short of an unconstitutional nightmare. But putting the legalities of this lawlessness aside for just a moment, what we are seeing is also terrifying. We are seeing crowds of people lawfully exercising their First Amendment rights to demand an end to police brutality and racist policing, being met with clouds of tear gas and other chemical weapons. We are seeing those same people shot directly in the head, causing skull fractures, and shot repeatedly in the back, causing large and painful contusions. Those that dare to bear witness are also being shot, pushed, and gassed, threatening to suppress the truth about these abuses. People are being dragged into unmarked vehicles, swept off the streets with no explanation. It is chilling. These tactics, anonymous policing, disappearing people through violence, or snatch and grab tactics, shows of force. These are tactics we have seen federal law enforcement use to intimidate, control, and devalue the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. For example, the ACLU of Oregon has filed a complaint on behalf of an Oregonian in Representative Bonamici's district, Isidro Andrade Tafoya, who came out of a county courthouse where he was accompanying his wife, only to be surrounded by immigration and customs enforcement officers in unmarked vehicles and plain clothes. The ICE officers accused Mr. Andrade Tafoya of being a person they suspected was in the country without lawful status. The only similarity between Mr. Andrade Tafoya and that person was the color of his skin, brown. In the name of national security, these DHS agencies, along with the U.S. Marshals Service, are terrorizing Oregonians and promising to raise the specter of their militarized violence and intimidation nationwide. These police tactics have no place in a free society and fly in the face of our country's founding constitutional principles: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, the right to petition our government for redress of grievances, of due process, of a presumption of innocence, of prohibiting unreasonable searches and seizures, of power held by we the people. The ACLU has responded with several lawsuits nationwide, including cases in Oregon, seeking to prohibit the dispersal and use of force against journalists, legal observers, and medics providing aid to injured protesters. And we will continue to defend the rights of protesters in Oregon and beyond against the onslaught of attacks we are seeing. There are two injuries that continue to stick with me. First, while rendering aid to police wounded protesters, a medic, clearly marked with a red cross, was shot in the chest with a tear gas canister. Second, while wearing a bright green National Lawyers Guild legal observer hat and documenting activity in downtown Portland, a federal officer shot a person in the heart with a 40mm impact munition. This second attack was shortly after a district court judge issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting federal law enforcement officers from targeting journalists and legal observers, including legal observers in green NLG hats. Where police wear badges, these community members wear severe bruises. These injuries stick with me because they make clear the threat. What is under attack in this country is the heart of our democracy. Congress must intervene to rein in these abuses with the following actions. And I've provided a little bit more detail in written testimony to you all. But Congress must take these following actions. Congress must urge the Department of Justice to appoint a special counsel to investigate criminal violations of constitutional rights. Congress must compel DOJ to produce the MOUs or any other agreements between federal agents and local law enforcement in Portland and elsewhere. And Congress must rein in the tools and tactics used by federal agents to commit civil rights violations, including prohibiting the indiscriminate use of so-called less lethal weapons, and requiring federal agents to be identifiable. And finally, I'd like to urge everyone who makes up We the People to engage this national conversation and to take action to ensure that the lawlessness of this administration ends. Call your government leaders, hold them accountable to reining in these abuses. Thank you.
Ms. Simon, thank you for your excellent statement to the roundtable. We are very much appreciated. And I'm calling now on Christopher David. You are recognized for 5 minutes for your statement.
Congressman Raskin and Democratic members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here to be before you today to discuss my experience in the ongoing protests in Portland, Oregon. My name is Chris David. What I witnessed when I attended the protests was a shocking attack by our own government on peaceful citizens expressing their support for Black Lives Matter and police reform. I have to mention at the outset that my experience of these events is permanently shaped by my service in the United States Navy. 36 years ago, I walked through the gates of the United States Naval Academy as a scared 17-year-old high school graduate from Lakewood, Colorado. I grew up in the western part of the United States. The East Coast was a mystery to me. It actually still is. Everything looked old, green, and full of wisdom. How could I fit into such a place as this? It turns out that most of us entering the Naval Academy felt that way, no matter where we came from across this great land. But the Academy became our unifying experience, the forge that heated and hammered us into one unit with the same goal and purpose, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that is why I am sitting here with you today. The testimony and experiences that I share today are mine and mine alone. I do not speak for the Naval Academy or my fellow vets. I speak for myself. I'd always believed that when taking the oath of office, everyone else believed as we did when we took ours. That was my hope, my lodestar. That's how the United States continued to strive and make itself better. But I was wrong, very wrong. Having watched the early days of July turn what were predominantly peaceful protests into violence in a small area in downtown Portland, I came to understand that for some people, the oath is just a set of words, not a calling. I watched on TV as federal officers in unmarked uniforms arbitrarily abduct U.S. citizens from the streets of Portland and shove them into rented minivans. I was shocked and appalled. If the U.S. government could do this to our fellow citizens, where would it end? Anybody can buy surplus military uniforms and rent a minivan. How do we know that these really are the feds when it happens again? What if it's really the Proud Boys or the Boogaloos? This was a slippery slope with massive implications for all of our freedoms, not just freedom of speech. My decision to attend the protest was a spontaneous one, and I had almost gone down the previous night. I regret not doing so since I missed a spectacular display of naked defiance and raw courage, courage that I myself do not possess. When I got down to the area of the protest, I stood by the building next door to the federal courthouse and listened to a group of physicians from the Oregon Health Sciences University talk about the serious harm that federal officers were acting upon their fellow citizens. The broken bones, the fried lungs, the damaged heads and brains. This was not Portland. This was not the United States I had sworn to defend. I walked the perimeter of the protest and was shocked to see how small the affected area actually was. 4 square city blocks. That was it. From what the administration had been telling us, all of downtown Portland was in flames with uncontrolled and widespread looting everywhere. Nope, just 4 square city blocks. It was also peaceful when I arrived, with more the air of a festival and people excited by their cause than the violence or looting depicted by the administration. Only later at night did the mood change, as people anticipated the arrival of the federal officers like a violent and gassy wind. Everybody knew it was going to arrive, just not exactly when or where from. When the federal officers emerged from the courthouse, I saw them rush at the protesters in the Southwest intersection, plowing into them and knocking them down. I watched this happen in shock. I then stepped out of the park and into the street just north of the intersection and stood there, just several feet from the curve. When the federal officers were done dispatching the peaceful protesters in the intersection, they turned their attention toward me. The first one leveled his weapon at me as he approached, then lowered it. The second officer then plowed into me, knocking me back several feet. I then squared up, stood my ground, still stunned by what was happening. A much smaller officer then proceeded to hit me with a baton 5 times, as other officers sprayed a chemical irritant into my face from a very short range. Blinded and with a broken hand, I offered the officers a disgusted farewell salute and then started back toward the park and into a giant cloud of tear gas. Stumbling and blinded, I was rescued by a volunteer street medic named Tav, who cared for me and bravely evacuated me to safety. It was an amazing act of courage on Tav's part, but for them and the others who were out to help, it was just another night of selfless bravery. This is the country that we have now become. Selfless, volunteer civilian combat medics are needed to rescue their fellow citizens from the depredations of the federal government. There is one thing that gives me hope, however, and that is the many people from different backgrounds who are raising their voices against this outrage. A shining example for me is Dustin Obermeyer, a giant USNA graduate from the class of 2001, a true combat hero, and former Marine helicopter pilot with 3 tours into 2 different war zones. As it turns out, he was standing right next to me when I was struck and gassed by federal officers. It was his first protest also, and he came down with the same question I did. Why are you not honoring your oath to the Constitution? And from that night, the Wall of Vets was born. Now we are working together to add another voice to the call for justice so sorely needed in this country. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my experience, and thank you for bringing these issues to light. I have 2 other things to say that are off my statement. Black Lives Matter. That's the only reason I'm here. That's the only reason all of vets here are here. Black Lives Matter. And one last thing, I exist. I'm not fake news. Thank you.
Mr. David, thank you for your statement very much. And Professor Snyder, you are now granted your 5 minutes for your statement.
Thank you very much, Congressman Raskin, members of the roundtable, friends from Portland. It's an honor to be with you all. I'm a professor of history at Yale. I'm also an activist and a protester, but I'm here with you in my guise as a historian. What I'd like to do with my time is to make 3 points about how the things that we've heard and the things that we've experienced in Portland fit into what we know from history about how authoritarian regimes arise. I'll be speaking about what I will call the unauthorized and unnamed federal secret police force, which is the best way that I can think of to categorize it. It looks like a secret police, so that's the term that I'm going to use. The 3 points have to do with the origins of this force, the nature of this force, in particular, how a secret police must always be in contradiction with the rule of law, and the consequences of such a force, in particular with respect to our elections this November. So, point number 1 about the origins. What we know about authoritarian regime change is that it doesn't usually happen overnight. It usually happens because high officials find loopholes in the law. They push the meaning of the law to its limits and beyond. They seek or create conditions of emergency, which they then exploit. This matches precisely the situation that we're in. where the head of the Department of Homeland Security hasn't been confirmed by the Senate, where the order to carry out violence was exceptionally vague, and where the justification for violence is also very hard to define. The justification, and this is the second troubling thing about the origins of these actions, is based upon an ideology. The fact that this violence is being used to protect monuments is not just incidental. I think it's actually rather central to what's going on. A monument is not a person, and in particular, a Confederate monument, or monuments that the president particularly likes, tell us a story about a certain kind of innocence in the country. They tell us a story about how it was the white people who were always correct. They tell us a story about how we, the white people, are the innocent ones, and the other people have always been on us. They have always been the aggressors. This tendency to replace the real concerns with real human beings with a mythical past has a name, and that name is fascism. When we move away from concern for law and individual rights and toward a story about myth and innocence which justifies violence, we're moving towards fascism. A second aspect about the origins of this, which is very troubling, is language. If one reads Mr. Trump's fundraising documents or listens to Mr. Trump or Mr. Wolf or Mr. Barr, the basis for these actions sound very much like a conspiracy theory. The idea that there are groups of, using their words, terrorists or anarchists is a very troubling notion, because these words are precisely the trigger words which have been used throughout the 20th century to signal that some people are outsiders, some people don't deserve the protection of the rule of law, some people don't really belong to the nation or the society or the body of citizens. It is all right, in fact, it's required, therefore, that we punish those people. Another feature of this language is that if they are terrorists and anarchists, that means that we are the victims. We're just defending ourselves. The final part of the origins, which is troubling, has to do with the personnel. Historically speaking, secret police forces have very often been drawn from two sources. The first of these is border zones. So, for example, in the Spanish Civil War, the troops which ended up being victorious in the far right were troops which have been fighting in a border zone, one of countless examples. In the case of German history, the origins of the SS are as concentration camp guards. Now, these may seem like esoteric examples until we remember that it appears that the men who are carrying out violence in Portland and the men who might carry out violence in the future come precisely from border zones. And if they've been working in our vast network of detention centers, they've also been working in lawless zones. In other words, they come from the places where historically secret police forces come. The dynamic is that men in border zones or men in lawless zones learn exceptional violent behavior, and then they're turned against everyone. The second basic point I wanted to make has to do with the nature of a secret police force. A secret police force, by its nature, has to contravene the rule of law. A secret police force is characteristic not of a rule of law state, not of a republic or a democracy, but of an authoritarian or totalitarian state. Why? We've heard about why. Secret police forces break the laws, it's known. What happened to Mr. Pettibone is assault and kidnapping. Those are violations of the law. What's worse, if possible, is that when the secret police breaks the law, and we saw this in the response of Homeland Security, what will happen is that officials will say everything we do is legal by definition. And that kind of retrospective justification is what destroys the rule of law. If whatever the secret police do is then excused or defended and described as legal because they did it, then the rule of law ceases to have any meaning. A second feature of the nature of the secret police is its unaccountability, which Mr. Pettibone and Mr. David have already stressed. You don't know how to react to unmarked people. You don't know if they're officers or not. And again, as Mr. David and Mr. Pettibone have both already stressed, these kinds of actions encourage imitation. It doesn't take much to rent a van, put on camouflage, and hurt people. That's an easy idea to have. And in the worst case, what happens is that the government-sponsored secret police and the paramilitaries end up in some kind of open or implicit cooperation. The final thing I want to say about the nature of the secret police that we've seen in this testimony is its unpredictability. It's intolerable not to know who you're confronted with. It's also intolerable not to know when you might be arrested and for what. Unpredictability is the definition of terror. Our encounters with law enforcement and with the government in general should be predictable. They should follow rules. The definition of terror is that you don't know if men are going to show up in the middle of the night and take you away. And this is unfortunately very close to what happened in Portland, all too close. In fact, it is what happened in Portland. The third and last point are the consequences. We're in a very particular historical moment now, where we have a chief executive who has never exhibited any support for the rule of law or for democracy, where we're in the midst of a terrible economic collapse, and where we're also in the midst of a pandemic which has caused mass death. As others have already mentioned, the images created by violence, the images of provoked violence, have been used in Mr. Trump's electoral propaganda. They've been used in his ads. They've been used in his fundraisers. And the final way, or the most specific way this is alarming, is in connection with his tweet of 30 July, the one in which he called for delaying the elections. Now, sometimes we comfort ourselves by saying he can't do that himself. But of course, no leader can ever do anything by himself. What matters is the response. Those 3 question marks at the end of that tweet are a call for help. They're an appeal to Americans. What can we do to make a mess of these elections between now and November? And I'm afraid that we have to consider this new, unaccountable, unnamed federal secret police force as one agent that might respond to that appeal. Again, historically, it's very often the case that authoritarian regimes arise during an election which is messed up. The final point, and here I'd like to echo something that Lou Frederickson said, the essence of all of this is that racism can't be reconciled with democracy. Racism in the United States most directly affects Blacks and people of color. But so long as we have prevalent racism in the country, democracy is also impossible for the rest of us, which is how all of this, I believe, fits together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Snyder, for your excellent statement. We're going to go right to member questioning at this point, and I'm going to yield first to my distinguished colleague from the District of Columbia, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is recognized for 5 minutes. Or you may need to unmute.
All right. Can you hear me and can you see me?
But I can hear you, Eleanor. There we go. Now you're fine. Go right ahead.
I want to thank you for this roundtable. Very much needed to probe this incident, which really begins in the nation's capital, which I represent. It in a real sense is the epicenter, and it's spread from here to Portland. As a result, I have a bill that would make sure that federal officers have body cameras and dashboard cameras. But here we're not even talking cameras. We're talking identification. No uniforms, no name tags to indicate who these were. And I have a bill that would say that there have to be name tags along with the agency, by the way, for federal and local police. So we always know in a country where police state is not honored who the police are. The appropriators have passed a bill that will allow the DC police to be federalized. So my question really goes to, I suppose, to Professor Levin and Kelly Simon of the ACLU, because I'm looking to see if there are more remedies that we could pursue. So my question is, in light of the remedies I have spoken of, and that we are already pursuing, what do we do when federal police and local police have jurisdiction? Local police is a local matter, but they're federal buildings. Do we need legislation? Do we need written agreements between federal and local police? What would each of you suggest as further remedies when both have jurisdiction?
was addressed to Ms. Simon, I think.
Thank you, Representative Norton. Kelly Simon again, ACLU of Oregon. I would encourage a further conversation with my national colleagues on this one as well. But I think there are serious questions, at least with respect to body cams, whether providing additional funding to an agency that displays such lawlessness is the right approach to invest more resources rather than divest. And with respect to kind of this cooperation that issue that you raised, I think having clear agreements that are available to the public as well, so that I think one issue that we've seen in Oregon in particular is a serious lack of transparency around exactly how agencies are working together. I think we've seen our local agencies want to distance themselves from federal law enforcement, and at the same time appear to be working in very close concert with those same agencies. So I think agreements with transparency would be helpful. And then with respect to kind of policing around buildings, I think the statute, section 1315, that provides some of this authority, the language is very vague about kind of this area around federal property. And we've seen under the auspices of policing or kind of protecting our federal courthouse, as Mr. Pettibone mentioned, he was on Broadway in Portland. That's essentially 7th Street, and our courthouse is on 3rd or 7th Avenue, and that's essentially excuse me, our courthouse is on 3rd Avenue. That's 4 blocks away, and it's I think to claim that there's a protection of courthouses action or activity going on in that moment doesn't seem consistent to me. So those are my initial reactions, but would invite further conversation with myself and my colleagues in our national office as well.
Thank you very much. Do any of the rest of you have any suggestions when both have jurisdiction to make sure that they can cooperate and coordinate?
Could I jump in, Congresswoman?
Please do. Please do.
So I yield to Kelly Simon on the specifics. I would just make a couple of broad points from what I know of the history of other police forces. The first is that the more decentralization you have, the better. And that means that it's not a good idea to have big federal agencies that can fund local police forces and thereby co-opt them, which for me raises the larger question of the existence of the Department of Homeland Security. If I were in Congress, I would be asking questions at that level. I'm not sure as a citizen, and I'm very dubious as a historian of authoritarianism about the existence of an institution which calls itself Homeland Security. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Oh, goodness. All right.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. We're going to go now to Congresswoman Bonamici.
Thank you so much. This testimony has been so powerful. And I want to follow up on something Congressman Raskin said in his opening statement. Yes, there were some people, a handful perhaps, small number of people engaged in destructive acts and vandalism, but we have to say without question that the actions of these federal troops were taken against innocent, peaceful protesters exercising their constitutional rights, who were gassed and beat and shot at, and that's just horrific. And I'm going to try to get several questions in. So to Mark Pettibone and Christopher David, thank you so much for sharing. I can't imagine what you went through and what was in your mind at that time. Have either of you heard anything since these instances where you were captured and kidnapped and questioned or beat and gassed? Have you heard anything from the federal government, any type of apology or explanation? And importantly, have you been able to figure out who took these actions against you? Mark or Chris?
I'll start. Yeah. I have not been contacted by any federal agency. The only information I have is what I get kind of secondhand from the news. I think initially there was some confusion about which agency picked me up. I read something that CBP finally admitted that it was their agency, and they claimed that they had the wrong guy or something like that. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, they sent a team called BORTAC, which is kind of a SWAT team for the border. Christopher, have you heard anything, any kind of apology or explanation, and have you been able to find out who was it who beat you and sprayed you?
There we go. Let's see here. I'm going to answer all of those pieces of the question. I have had nobody from the Department of Justice contact me and apologize. I don't expect an apology based upon the way they're behaving right now. I have, in fact, met with the Department of Justice Inspector General. I am not 100% sure who beat me. We think it is the U.S. Marshal Service that beat me up. But even the Department of Justice Inspector General could not tell me that that was 100% true. So I still don't know.
Thank you. One of the problems of having unidentified agents. Senator Frederick, thank you. Did you hear when you were down at the protest, did you hear any warning before gas was sprayed and before these troops came out into the crowd to push the crowd back? Did you hear any warning? And then also, how have things changed now in the last couple of days since the negotiation between the governor and the federal government?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. On a couple of nights, I heard warnings, and in a couple of nights, we heard nothing. They just sort of came out and said they came out and started firing. Basically, that's what I heard when I was there. Now, the difference is extraordinary in terms of just sheer numbers. There are people you can put all the folks who are there downtown pretty much on the street itself, and maybe a little bit into the park because there's just significantly fewer people. But there are, when I was down there, while the federal folks were there were easily 6,000 to 10,000 people in that 6-block range there, filling the streets constantly. Right, they made it. There was no distancing, social distancing going on. There was just so many people in that particular spot. It has calmed down significantly. There was always a sense of camaraderie, especially before it became dark. You had that kind of thing going on. Now, in the last, I haven't been down there I didn't go down there last night or the night before, so I haven't been down there in 2 nights. There are folks who have been down there have told me that it is really relatively quiet, small numbers of folks, still lots of people chanting, lots of good speeches taking place with megaphones talking about what the issue is in terms of Black Lives Matter. And so you get that kind of approach. There are some folks who have attempted to start some fires, and they've been put out with water bottles, and folks and have made it clear that that's not what they're about. So there's a small number. There are, I saw no one, I've not heard of anybody in downtown dealing with tear gas at this point. There was an incident that took place last night on the east side of Portland, in front of the East Portland police station. It's a sheriff's station over there on 47th and Burnside. And so there were several things that took place there. I'm still trying to get an understanding of that, thanks to the support of the ACLU.
Senator, I'm going to run out of time. I just want to ask you, Senator Frederick, is there any doubt in your mind that the presence of the federal troops exacerbated the harm being caused to peaceful protesters or the tensions in our community?
No doubt at all, Congresswoman. In fact, I think that was the intent. There was no doubt at all that they literally threw gasoline on the fire.
Thank you. And I think I have another couple of seconds. Professor Snyder, Acting Secretary Brad Wolf, who I note has been acting for longer than 210 days, talked about violent anarchists and how the city was under siege. How does this alarmist language hurt our communities, and why does it matter?
Language is extremely important. We know that from the history of the Soviet Union. We know it from the history of Nazi Germany. Language always precedes action, and the particular way that language like that precedes action is that it marks off other people as being them. If everyone who protests is somehow violent or somehow an anarchist, that means that they're them and they're not us. We're the real citizens. They're not. Violence is justified against them. That is the language which prepares the way for violence. And it's expanding, right? First, it's directed against the undocumented, and it's directed against Blacks. Soon it's directed against protesters. And it will continue to expand until we notice its content and we stop it.
Thank you. Time's about to expire and I yield back. Thank you, Congressman Raskin.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bonamici. I'm going to recognize myself for questioning now. I wanted to start with you, Mr. David. The founders of the country were seriously afraid of a standing army because they thought that it would be a threat to the civil liberties of the people and it would become a provocation against public security. And I think that your actions in this whole affair captured the imagination of the country because you seem to maintain that sensibility that the armed forces have to be servants to the people and not dominators of the people. So I just wonder if you would reflect for a second about that question you raised about your oath, why you felt that your oath of office still obtained even though you're not active duty right now, but also what your obligations were as a citizen that brought you out to the protests.
Okay, so there are two parts to that. So imagine you're 17 years old and you go to the Naval Academy and you spend 4 years, 4 very hard years, 4 very formative years of your life, training just to take that oath to the Constitution. You're probably going to take it pretty seriously. Now, my duty as a citizen is the same as my duty as a former naval officer. It is to uphold the oath to the Constitution, even if as a civilian I didn't take that oath. I think all of us are duty bound to remember that this country is founded as a liberal democracy based on the US Constitution. It is our highest calling. We are not loyal to one person. We are not loyal to one party. We are loyal to the Constitution, both as citizens and when we take the oath of office in the military as well. Now, I wanted to address some of your earlier comments about the founders being worried about a standing army. Well,
Maybe
that is exactly what Trump has created. What was that?
Yeah.
That is exactly what Trump has created. His own internal standing militia.
Yeah, thank you for that. Senator Frederick, let me come back to you. It was fascinating to me that in a conversation that could have just been about the rights of the people, which were besieged and under attack in Oregon, you brought it back to the underlying purpose and meaning of the protest. And so you linked the rights of the people to what the people have right, which is the centrality of racism. I think Professor Snyder sort of ended on that same point in his statement where he said that racism and democracy are ultimately incompatible with each other. And I wonder if you would reflect on that for a second. Do you think that the events that took place in Oregon are an expression of the threat that racism and the force that supports it, it's the threat that racism has against democracy and poses to democracy?
Well, I think so. That's clear. I think that what we really are talking about, quite frankly, is a reset. The one thing that I'm pleased with this, that I think this virus has brought to us, is a reset and understanding what some of the basic concepts behind our democracy and how we work together. So racism is a very clear part of that, and I've had that as part of my life, all my life. So it's something that I see as something we've said, but it was also something Dr. King talked about. We are in fact cashing a check. We're now saying the democracy said it was going to have this check. It was insufficient funds when he spoke about it, and I have a dream speech. we are now saying, no longer. We now know the funds are there. It's time to take a step and do something to really keep up the democracy that we have.
You talk about military forces essentially being trained at the border to violate people's rights and to disregard human rights constraints and so on, and then being called back into service against the people as a key sign of advancing authoritarianism. I wonder if you would give us some historical examples of armed forces that have been used in that way against outsiders, then being turned against the domestic population.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I would just say against other members of the domestic population. History is absolutely full of this, whether we think of the persecution of Jews and other minorities in the Russian Empire by Cossacks, who are by definition a border force, whether we think of the Spanish Civil War, where it was the fascists who won thanks to armed forces who had been fighting in North Africa, whether we think of Nazi Germany, where policemen were gathered up and sent to carry out atrocities on or beyond the border and then brought back to govern Nazi Germany. This is basically the mainstream of history. What we're experiencing now is sadly totally normal. It's a lesson that we ought to learn. If you brutalize the border, which is what we've done, you create people who are capable of brutalizing anyone, which is now what we're seeing.
Very good. And my time is up. And I think now I'm going to recognize Chairwoman Maloney for her 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Jamie Raskin, for your lifelong commitment to human rights and civil rights and leading this effort. And I thank the staff of the Oversight Committee, Candace and others, and all the members that are supporting this, and especially my colleagues, Suzanne Bonamici and Earl Blumenauer. I would say that they are now national leaders on this and coming forward with ideas to help us to keep the federal agents out of our cities. And they don't belong in the cities of New York and other places that I represent. And I thank you for making this happen. I was thinking that one of the challenges that we've had in Congress was responding to the loss of John Lewis, whom Eleanor Holmes Norton called the bravest of the protesters in our lifetime. And I want to especially thank the participants, the protesters that are with us. But my first question is for Ms. Simon. And I want to ask you, did you believe that it was appropriate for federal agents to be sent in against the wishes of state and local leaders? I understand that every single elected leader, from the mayor to the governor to the AG, and in fact, the governor said that it was a blatant abuse of power by the federal government, and said that the president was looking for a confrontation in Oregon. And so I want to ask you, did you believe that it was appropriate for the federal agents to be sent in against the wishes of every elected state and local leader? And how has the ACLU sought to respond to this aggressive strategy by the federal government? And how can we, who are experiencing fierce protests in our communities and our cities now, prevent this from happening in our own localities and going through the same, I would call it abuse, that Oregon has confronted with a federal intervention?
Thank you, Congresswoman Maloney. Nothing about what the federal government did here was appropriate, regardless of the opinions of our elected officials in Oregon. As I framed it up earlier, it truly was escalation on top of escalation. We were already experiencing a severe level of police violence at the hands of our local police, and this was absolutely inappropriate and only made matters worse. In terms of your question about, and I'm just like losing it in my mind because we've been so full, but what the community can do to prevent this from happening in your home state and what the ACLU has been doing to push back against these abuses. We've been engaged in several lawsuits. We are not alone in engaging in lawsuits. organizations. There's a Black-led organization called Don't Shoot Portland that has filed a couple of lawsuits as well to push back on these abuses. What the community can do is band together. It's been really beautiful to see how the Portland community has formed medics units and groups of people to feed the protesters. Standing together right now and making it known that this activity, these abuses from our government are inappropriate, that we won't stand for them, and continuing to declare that Black Lives Matter, continuing to listen to Black-led voices, organizations, our Black leaders like Senator Frederick. I just thank you so much for your time and contributions here. Continuing to push back against racism in our country is how we defeat.
Thank you. And Senator Frederick, what was the reaction to President Trump's decision amongst state leaders like yourself, especially those who, like yourself, had been involved in the Black Lives Matter protests for months now?
Well, it was a very simple reaction, and that it was outrage. There was just absolutely no reason for him to do this, or for the administration to do it, and it was so clearly a ploy in terms of a political ploy that had nothing to do with dealing with safety for the community or ramping down the incidents or the intensity of what's going on. It was simply a political action that was designed to create as many problems as possible and injure as many people as possible. We expected that was going to happen as soon as we found out that the federal folks were in the streets of Portland.
Okay. And Professor Snyder, are you concerned about the deployment of Department of Homeland Security agents, that it flew in the face of all traditional notions of federalism?
Well, I guess that's one more American argument. I mean, that there's so many constitutional problems with what happened, and you've named an important one. I would just put a historical spin on it, which is that the way authoritarian regimes generally form is that they centralize the police. They find ways of deploying centralized force everywhere. So one way to look at what's just happened is that one way that this was secret is the federal part of it, right? We don't even know right away that these are federal officers. We have no idea who they are. The federal government has found many loopholes, and one of the loopholes is deploying this unauthorized and unnamed secret police out anywhere that it chooses to. I go back to this justification in terms of monuments and statues, which is so very weird in so many different ways. But one feature of this justification about monuments and statues in the president's executive order is that it literally means that forces can be deployed anywhere. If your neighbor has a garden gnome and you're thinking bad thoughts about that garden gnome, in principle, Homeland Security could come after you, right? So that justification does away with any kind of limit, including federalism.
And coming back to your experiences, Senator Frederick, how did the Department of Homeland Security's deployment affect your state's ability to respond to the protests and manage the situation on the ground?
Well, in fact, the protests and the number of people protesting, as well as any sort of vandalism or anything else that was going on, had dropped significantly. They had gotten to relatively small numbers, and the Portland police and others were beginning to find the folks who were doing the damage, any damage that was being done. They were able to isolate them because there were so few of them at that particular point. As soon as the federal folks showed up, it went from a couple of hundred folks in front of the Justice Center to up to 6,000 to 10,000 people objecting to it. So people were starting to talk with one another and come to some kind of conclusion. They're continuing that now, but the month of dealing with the federal folks created such a problem that we weren't able to have conversations because they were coming in and doing things that we had no control over.
And so to conclude,
the gentlelady's time has expired. Forgive me for cutting you off, Madam Chair, but we have with us also our colleague, Congresswoman Robin Kelly from Illinois, and I'm going to recognize her for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin, for holding this roundtable, and thank you to all the witnesses. I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your thoughts and suggestions. I represent the south side of Chicago and the south suburbs and a rural area. As you know, the FBI has come to town, and we had a conversation with our U.S. Attorney before they came, and then after that conversation, we had a conversation with our mayor, who, you know, was okay with more FBI, DEA, and ATF because they're there anyway. The Chicago police work with them all the time. She was not okay. She doesn't want Homeland Security or Border Patrol. The Illinois delegation did tell her that if she has any reason to think that something is changing or something is different, then they shared with us what they were going to do to be sure to let us know. But I wanted to ask you guys, did you have this warning that they were coming? Did they just show up? Was it under one guys? I know they were supposed to be protecting the buildings, but for us, it's helping us find some of the predators are all about gun. We do have a lot of gun violence. We need help. No one denies that. It's the type of help. You know, we don't want just any help. And was your mayor or governor under some other thought, and then it changed drastically, or because I guess I'm trying to figure out what do we need to watch out, and whoever wants.
Well, I can speak to a little bit of that. I will say very simply that I know of no local official who called for the to come in. In fact, the federal who I've talked with, who have told me off the record that they didn't ask for them to come in either. So this decision was made over the objection of people who are on the ground and were dealing with the issues. I would encourage you to track and see who's coming in. I mean, I hate to say this way, but I really don't trust that Homeland Security is going to tell you the truth about anything. So let's just be real clear about that. And when they're coming in, what they're planning on officially doing, and whether they have actually got some folks set aside to create havoc so that then they can justify being there.
Know that I think supposedly at least 150 agents were coming into Chicago, but they were not supposed to be in the streets. Strictly, you know, investigation, research, like those kind of things. And we haven't heard anything different. And actually this weekend could just be coincidental, even though still too many people were shot and killed. We lost a 9-year-old boy playing basketball. It was less than the previous weekend. So I don't know if that had something to do with them or not. Also, the other thing is just, you know, every time I think I'm okay, and then Senator, when I listen to you and you just want to be safe, it just tears me up, you know, on the inside. And the other witnesses, when you say Black Lives Matter, it brings me to tears, you know, that it feels like people are finally, I'm not saying you guys didn't get it, but it just seems like people are finally getting, you know, what we've been trying to say and what we've been experiencing forever, you know, and you know, and it's just so important that this is just not a moment, that this is a movement, and not only in, you know, police violence, but also in the corporate world, in the education world, in the healthcare world. We just need, you know, we need to diversify. We need to see some leadership in the, you know, in the boardrooms. That's nice. You want to change Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, and you want to give Juneteenth off, but next year there are going to be more people in the boardroom. Are there going to be less Black folks dying at the hands of the police? Those, to me, are really the true measures. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Kelly. And we turn now, finally, thank you for your patience, to Congressman Blumenauer. Thank you, as other members are about to go. Just to unmute Earl.
That work? Okay. You would think after 89 Zoom calls and WebEx that I'd figure this out. But I was so taken, I guess, by the testimony and thinking about the implications. I deeply appreciate your organizing this discussion and hope that it will lead to further engagement like this for Congress. We have tried to be clear from the outset, and I think your witnesses made it clear that this was absolutely a manufactured crisis from the federal government. The notion of our trying to come to grips with our own troubled history and then have the federal government come in and deliberately make it worse with really terrifying actions, I think is amazingly unsettling. Mr. Pettigrew, as an elected official from the federal government, I must apologize. I am horrified at what you were subjected to. As a result of your experience, have you learned of other people who have been treated in a similar fashion?
Excuse me. Yeah, there was, I know for a fact there was one other person in my exact position. I don't have their contact information. And I did talk with someone else who was in a similar position as far as being abducted by the federal officers. But I think there was a different outcome there in terms of, how charges and stuff like that. So there are more people, definitely.
Thank you. Senator Frederick, I appreciate your eloquence in lining it out, and your notion that removing the federal troops from the front line has calmed things down. You mentioned you hadn't been there the last couple of nights. I can tell you from direct observation, it feels quite calm down there the last couple of nights, and I hope we're able to continue in that fashion. You mentioned watching what some of the provocateurs had done. I think you mentioned ball bearings and a slingshot from some of the white supremacists in the back of the demonstrations. And in a large crowd, it's difficult to track them down. Do you have a sense of how we're experiencing some of the white supremacists on the periphery and their engagement?
Oh, I saw this, Congressman. Thank you. I saw this in the past. I saw it when I was down there in some of the demonstrations in the last month. There were folks who I recognized from previous demonstrations who had been part of the right-wing militant militia folks who were now sort of acting as though they were now part of the other demonstration, trying to get people to rush an area and then move back to the back. Other times they were moving. They had these firecracker poppers that would create problems. They were handing those out to people, but not being right on the front lines with it, but being in the back to create a sense of uncertainty and havoc there as much as possible. It's very obvious, and I get the feeling that there are some people who are finally starting to look for those folks and watch them. But it's a very important tactic on their part. It's a agents provocateurs thing that I've known since my days doing civil rights demonstrations.
Mr. David, you referenced the response you received in the aftermath of your attack, where people came forward, medics ministering to your needs. Can you speak to that dynamic in terms of the people there on the front lines being supportive in the face of putting themselves at risk?
Well, my history of protesting is only about 2 hours long because that's the only time I've ever gone and I haven't gone back. What I can tell you is based on my experiences and now my friendship with Tav, who's the medic who rescued me, is that it's stunning that we have to have a volunteer force of civilian combat medics to take care of protesters that have been beat up by federal officers. In fact, who knows whether they're federal officers or not? We really don't know. So I can't give you a long history, a long observational history of any of this, other than just my admiration for these street medics going out and doing what they have to do. They're doing it as volunteers. They're cobbling together equipment, which is why we started a GoFundMe to help give back to the street medics and other humanitarian, there are other people who deserve humanitarian aid. So we raised a little over $30,000, and we're going to start handing that out probably next week. But that's all I could do for them, right? Is to have a fundraiser in their honor, because I can't really do anything else at this point. I've got a broken hand. So my admiration for them, I just admire them. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would just note that it's not just the support for the people downtown in this portion of support. We have seen in the areas where protesters were marshaling for earlier demonstrations, there was an extensive array of people there with water, with supplies, directing traffic, holding I think the lid on and moving it forward. It is, I think, remarkable the degree that people have organized, supported one another, and helped maintain, in some cases where we were talking literally about thousands and thousands of people, the protesters themselves had that capacity to keep things under control, and they didn't need an armed intervention from the federal government to rile it up. They were doing their job in a way that I think is, in fact, remarkable. I appreciate your focusing on this. One last thing, Mr. David, you mentioned the wall of vets. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we've the wall of vets was essentially created that night when I discovered that the gentleman standing next to me, the very, very, very big gentleman standing next to me, was actually also a fellow graduate of the United States Naval Academy. We find that really so unbelievable to be beyond coincidence. And the interesting thing is that we both went down there with the same exact question, independently. We never have known each other before. We're good friends now. But that spurred in me the idea that we should have a wall of vets. They have a wall of moms, a wall of dads. Why not a wall of vets as well? And so with some incredible help from some incredible people, we started Wall of Vets for real. I don't know how many chapters we have. It's probably over 40 now. I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of weeks we'll have 100 chapters nationwide. And all of it is designed to try to, for us as vets, to give back to the United States and to the citizens as much as we can. We took our oath of office seriously. So we're going to do more than just protect protesters. We're going to go out on November 3rd and we're going to protect voters.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Blumenauer, and thank you for making that excellent point that if these were terrorists and anarchists trying to burn the city down, it's hard to see why thousands of Oregonians would come out to support them with water and to, build the wall of moms and the wall of dads and the wall of vets. It's very clear where law and order and legitimacy were in these protests. They were with the protesters. They were with the people in Black Lives Matter. And the illegitimacy and the threat to the security of the people and the rights of the people came from the federal agents that were sent in. And I want to read, before we close here, from the Attorney General of Oregon, Ellen Rosenblum, who sent us a statement, and it's a wonderful statement. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she said, overall, rather than de-escalate the situation here, these troops made things markedly worse. The federal agents who were sent to infringe protesters' First, Fourth, and 10th Amendment rights. That is, they impeded basic democratic values. and constitutional rights, the right to organize, to assemble, to march, and to speak out. They interfere with Portlanders' ability to protest very real systemic racism and to object to long-standing police mistreatment of the Black community. They swept up and they detained Portlanders unlawfully. So look, I want to thank all of our terrific guests today, Kelly Simon from the ACLU, Mark Pettibone, Christopher David, Senator Lou, Frederick, Professor Snyder, for your wonderful participation. I hope that millions of people come to watch this to understand what was really taking place in Oregon and to understand that the people and the civil rights movement, as with John Lewis, were on the side of justice and law and progress. And our late beloved colleague who helped to organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was adamant that nonviolence must be the end of the movement, but it also must be the means of the movement itself. And everybody understood that then, and they understand that now. In no amount of violent right-wing provocation or provocation by unmarked anonymous troops who stand completely outside of American constitutional history and tradition will obscure that reality. So I want to thank all of you for moving America forward on the question of civil rights, on the question of Black Lives Matter, and for standing for the rights and the liberties of the people. Special salute to Congressman Blumenauer, Congresswoman Bonamici. I want to thank the chair of the committee, Ms. Maloney, for making this possible, this roundtable, and thank all of you for participating. Please stay in touch. And the meeting is
Thank
now
you,
adjourned.
Congressman.